The purpose of this inquiry is to cut through the lies, to reveal the processes that are behind this bankruptcy, the class interests that are behind it, and to outline a political program on the basis of which the working class can conduct a struggle. And really the first, most essential starting point is to understand that what is going on here in Detroit is part of a process taking place throughout the country and, in fact, the world. A process in which the governments and ruling classes throughout the world are carrying out what we call a social counter-revolution. That is, to overturn gains established by workers really over a century of struggle, and to carry out an enormous redistribution of wealth to those at the top at the expense of masses of working people. Now, the bankruptcy of Detroit is in fact a turning point in class relations. It sets a precedent for an escalation of the war against the working class in the US and internationally, the same way that Reagan's firing of 13,000 air traffic controllers in 1981 did. In the next few days, the city's unelected emergency manager, Kevin Orr, essentially a dictator for the most powerful financial interests, is set to release his so-called plan of adjustment. Now, the word adjustment is a euphemism. It will, in fact, be a slash and burn plan. The basic outlines of this plan are clear. The working class is to pay for a financial crisis it did not create. Deep cuts will be imposed on the hard-earned pensions and health care benefits of 23,500 retired city workers. Workers will be sent to purchase private insurance with a stipend of $175 a month on Obama's new health care exchanges, and forced to pay impossible expenses, as much as $19,000 for a family a year, out of their meager pension checks before a penny is covered by the insurance companies. Current city workers will lose their jobs. Wages and benefits as sanitation, transit, and other essential services are privatized. The century-long city ownership of the Detroit Institute of Arts will be ended, and the control of the museum's priceless collection will be handed over to wealthy private foundations, which will further restrict access to culture for the public. The public lighting system will be handed to DTE Energy. New entrance fees are already being charged at Belle Isle, which has been taken over by the state and is being opened up for the construction of a new luxury hotel. The city's water and sewage system have announced plans to eliminate nearly half the jobs of workers to make it more attractive to private equity firms which plan to buy one of the largest water systems in the United States. And low-income residents at Griswold and other downtown residencies are being evicted to make room for state-subsidized stadiums and upscale housing projects that will further enrich billionaires like Mike Ilitch and Dan Gilbert. Now, behind this, discussions are underway to reach a so-called grand bargain with the city's main unions, which will in fact transfer control of a $500 million retiree healthcare trust fund into the hands of the union executives, a plan that was modeled off of what was done in the auto industry. In exchange for getting access to this slush fund, the union executives will dutifully announce their support for the deal and declare it was the best they could get. Now, as I said, the bankruptcy of Detroit is part of a national and, in fact, international social counter-revolution. It is also important to stress that the bankruptcy is being supported by the Obama administration, which filed a brief in the courts to back the bankruptcy filing by Kevin Orr, rejecting any Wall Street-type bailout for the city of Detroit, something that Gene Sperling, the economic advisor of Obama, made clear again just the other week. Obama is in fact using the crisis in Detroit as a test case to gut the pensions of millions of public employees around the United States. Meanwhile, the White House and Congress have cut off benefits to the long-term unemployed, agreed to slash another $9 billion from the food stamp programs, and passed a budget that will impose $1 trillion in cuts over the next decade. Obama's health care scheme is already gutting health insurance for millions and serving as a stepping stone for the privatization of Medicare and Social Security. Now, again, this is not limited, this policy, to the United States. All over the world, the operative word of every single government, whether ostensibly left or right, is austerity. Savage budget cuts and so-called structural adjustments are being imposed to pay for the financial crash of 2008 created by the global banks. These are some figures on the left. In Greece, public workers have already seen a 35% cut in their wages. Unemployment among young people is 66%. In Spain, on the right, a new system was started in January that will tie pensions to a so-called sustainability factor, meaning if the life expectancy, the average life expectancy increases in Spain, then Social Security benefits will be cut. Last month, a report by the Council of Europe's Human Rights Commissioner pointed to depression-level unemployment, falling food consumption, the, quote, pauperization of pensioners, and a return to child labor throughout the continent. And you can see throughout the world the figures on the growing gap between the wealthiest. In China, the income share held by the top 10% versus the bottom 40%. Throughout the world, the same processes. In Australia last week, Toyota joined Ford and General Motors in announcing the shutdown of the entire auto industry in the continent of Australia, threatening the jobs of some 250,000 workers. The global auto giants insist that such things as job security, safety, and pensions are simply unaffordable when they can get cheaper labor in other parts of the globe, including the United States. In other words, what's happening here is part of an international process. Whether in Athens, Madrid, Melbourne, or Detroit, the working class is facing an enormous historical retrogression with no end in sight. Meanwhile, a tiny corporate and financial elite that controls every lever of political power is enriching itself almost beyond comprehension. One figure captures this staggering social inequality produced by the capitalist system and reveals why capitalism must be abolished if mankind is to progress. According to a new report from the World Hunger Organization, Oxfam, the world's 85 richest individuals now have a net worth that's equal to 3.5 billion people on the planet. In fact, the wealth of the world's billionaires has increased from about $1 trillion in 1996 to about $5.5 trillion today. These are some of the figures. On the right-hand scale, the number of billionaires that has risen from 1987 to the present. and the wealth. The top line is the wealth of the world's billionaires, which took a bit of a plunge in the crash of 2008, and not only has recovered, but has gone way beyond, now reaching a total of about $5.5 trillion. Now, it's within this context that the attack on Detroit has particular significance. The ruling class is proceeding with such vengeance precisely because it has never reconciled itself to the achievements won by workers in the mass industrial struggles from the 1930s to the 1970s, whose major battleground, one of the major battlegrounds, was Detroit itself. Struggles that reverberated throughout the country and changed, in fact, class relations. Orr expressed his contempt for the working class when he told the Wall Street Journal last August, "For a long time, the city was dumb, lazy, happy, and rich." He complained that in the post-war period, it allowed us to have a covenant that held if you had an 8th grade education, you'll get 30 years of a good job and a pension and great health care, but you don't have to worry about what's going to come. Now, to this millionaire hatchet man who makes $275,000 to loot a city, the very idea that workers should have the right to secure and good-paying jobs, health care or pensions, or decent schools and museums for their families is utterly absurd. He speaks for the American ruling class that wants a return to the days when it held unchallenged sway as masters, and workers were little more than industrial slaves living in degradation without the slightest rights. But pensions, public education, access to health care were never handed to the working class. They were won only through the most bitter struggle, often against the violent resistance of the industrialists and financiers who ruled American society with an iron fist. The explosive growth of American capitalism in the decades after the American Civil War was in fact dependent upon an ample supply of cheap labor and brutal exploitation of millions of workers who flooded into the factories, the steel mills, and the coal mines from throughout the world. The introduction here in Highland Park of the assembly plant at Ford's Model T factory in 1913 maximized the amount of surplus value extracted from the working class, making Henry Ford the richest man in the world. It would take a worker 20 years of labor to equal what Henry Ford was making in his daily income. This is a scene in Highland Park, a few miles north of here. In January 1914, after Ford announced his much vaunted $5 a day wage, 10,000 job seekers lined up outside of the factory, hungry and cold. When they demanded jobs, management turned water hoses on them. What were the conditions for workers at this time, conditions that the American ruling class wants to reestablish today? According to contemporary accounts, workers slept in slums and boarding houses, 4 men to a bed, with no indoor plumbing, and suffered from an epidemic of inflamed gums, swollen jaws, and toothless mouths, with watery and infected eyes. Hospitals and churches took in hundreds of so-called foundlings, that is, babies abandoned by their parents who were too poor to feed them. The auto barons controlled the police, the judges, and the politicians. They hired spies and gun thugs to beat up workers and break their strikes. Particular venom was directed towards the socialists and left-wing militants who led the fight to organize industrial workers. After the 1917 Russian Revolution, thousands of suspected communists were rounded up and deported. In Detroit, scores of labor leaders were incarcerated by the Army at Fort Wayne and held indefinitely while their families were reduced to beggary. The employers utilized gangsters and fascist organizations like the KKK and the Black Legion, and used racism and anti-immigrant chauvinism to divide and weaken the working class. The 1929 Wall Street crash and Great Depression radicalized millions against the capitalist system and convinced them that only collective resistance could change their conditions. In a rebellion against the old AFL leaders, an explosion of mass struggles in Toledo, San Francisco, Minneapolis took place in 1934. And then, in 1936-37, auto workers made a breakthrough against the largest corporation in the world, General Motors, in the Flint sit-down strike. This inspired a wave of strikes and sit-downs across the country. And there was a growing conviction within the ruling class, as one author stated, that America's 1917 was coming. That is a reference to the October Revolution. Now, well aware of the dangers of trying to violently suppress this movement, as Hitler and Mussolini had done in Europe, Roosevelt initiated his New Deal to save the capitalist system from revolution. FDR enjoyed, as Leon Trotsky said, a country where the bourgeoisie succeeded in accumulating incalculable wealth. Against the opposition of many of his own class, he gave legal recognition to the unions and enacted several reforms, including Social Security, minimum wage laws, child labor laws, overtime payments, and a national works project. Taxes on the wealthy were sharply increased. Now, it's perhaps hard to imagine when the word reform actually meant an improvement for the working class. And concessions, the word concessions, referred to the concessions made by the capitalists to workers. But the semi-insurrectional struggles of the 1930s forced the American ruling class into a temporary retreat and fundamentally changed class relations. Over the next 4 decades, in fact, militant strikes and mass struggles would be a central feature of American life. Workers in the U.S., like their counterparts throughout the world, were determined not to go back to the hungry 30s. I'd like to just point out a few figures that showed the transformation in social relations from the 1930s through the 1960s and early 70s. That is the product of the struggles of the working class. This is on the increase in strikes in the 1930s. But here, this is one interesting figure, something that the American ruling class actually is very upset about. That is that life expectancy grew, that improvements in the conditions of the working class, access to health care, access to sewage systems, access to culture, led to a growing life expectancy from the 1930s to the present period. What about the issue of high school graduation rates? There were tens of thousands of youth in the 1930s in Detroit, which at best were going to school half a day. Many young people were still at work, and that was throughout the country. As a product of the struggles of the working class, a substantial increase, enormous increase, in the amount of young people who went to school. Per capita income, adjusted for inflation, tripled between 1935 and 1975. At the same time, taxes on the wealthy rose from 25% on the top bracket in 1929 to nearly 90% in 1965. In the 40s and 50s, workers struck and won the right to old age pensions and employer-paid health care. And this was epitomized by Detroit. By 1960, the Motor City had the highest per capita income of any city in the United States. It also had the highest home ownership rate and among the best public school systems in America. Now, I don't want to romanticize conditions in post-war America. Even in the most prosperous period of American capitalism, nearly 20% of all Americans were still mired in poverty. Roosevelt's claim that the capitalist system could guarantee workers the right to economic security was never materialized. Nevertheless, the working class had managed to increase its share of the wealth produced by its own labor. Now, historically speaking, however, the period of rising living standards in America was relatively short-lived. By the 1960s and early 70s, American capitalism went into a deep historic and economic decline. It faced challenges from Japan, from Europe, and the American ruling class changed its policy from social and class compromise to a policy of class war. And this was symbolized in 1979 when Paul Volcker, the Federal Reserve Chairman, a Wall Street banker appointed by President Carter, deliberately raised interest rates to provoke the worst economic crisis since the Depression and to deliberately use mass unemployment to beat back the resistance of the workers. Now, one of the first targets of this policy of class war was Detroit, which was described in a congressional report on the 1980 Chrysler bailout as a city, quote, known to have some of the most inefficient and troublesome workforces available. And how did the American ruling elite respond? They wiped out 30,000 Chrysler jobs, imposed $250 million in concessions in 1980. This was followed by Reagan's firing of the air traffic controllers in 1981, and a decade of union busting, mass unemployment, plant closings, which was used, as I said, to claw back the gains that workers had made in the preceding. At the same time, if you look around 1980, as I said, tax on the richest parts of the population rose to almost 90% around 1950. Then you see here, 1980, under the Reagan administration, it plunged. And a vast redistribution of wealth that goes on to this day continued. Now, what was the response of the unions to this attack? They were utterly incapable of defending the working class. Defending capitalism and hostile to socialism, they responded to the crisis of capitalism by embracing a program of labor management partnership. They suppressed strikes and isolated struggles when they did break out. They sought to channel the anger of workers away from the corporations and the government with anti-Japanese racism and buy-American chauvinism. This is a quote from the leader of the UAW at Chrysler, making it quite clear the position of the unions. Now again, this is when Chrysler was gutting 30,000 jobs in this city. I believe that the company will have to trim operations down. But what can you do about it? We have a free enterprise system in this country. The corporations have a right to make a profit. Well, that is precisely the policies and politics that have produced the current disaster for the working class. Now, what else? This is a very important chart showing the blue line is the strikes involving over 1,000 workers. You can see still in the post-war period, there were many struggles. There was a very big spike, including 400,000 auto workers here in Detroit that went on strike at General Motors in 1970. But after the collaboration, 1979, the Chrysler bailout, strikes have virtually disappeared. At the same time, the wealth of the richest 1% has skyrocketed. As the trade unions collaborated in the lowering of wages and conditions, the wealth of the financial and corporate elite skyrocketed. Now, in 2005, I think very important remarks were made by the head of Delphi Corporation when he threw the company into bankruptcy, Delphi being General Motors' former parts division. His name was Stephen Miller. He had been a CEO in the airlines, in the steel industry, and also in auto. And he said the following. He was talking about these three industries. He said what they had in common was a social contract worked out over the past half century with strong centralized labor unions to elevate their workforces with elaborate defined benefit retirement programs. Back in the days, he said, when you worked for one employer till age 65 and then died at 70, when healthcare was unsophisticated and inexpensive, this social contract made some economic sense. Today, such pensions are an anachronism, and we are witnessing the slow death of such benefits as industrial policy. People are living longer these days, and medical science is rapidly expanding the capability to spend money to keep you alive for decades. Of course, that's a good thing. But the question is, how can we afford it? So by the mid-2000s, it was becoming more and more the conception in the corporate, political, financial establishment that workers in America were simply living too long. That it was necessary to cut pensions, to reduce life expectancy, and to roll the billions of dollars which were owed, trillions of dollars, which were owed to retired workers, to keep that as profit, to keep that as investment capital. Now, when Obama came to power, inaugurated in 2009, he was determined to carry out what the corporate and financial elite considered unfinished business from what it had attained in the 1980s. After bailing out Wall Street, his next major act was to attack the so-called middle-class living standards of Detroit auto workers. The forced bankruptcy and restructuring of General Motors and Chrysler, carried out with the collaboration of the UAW, led to a staggering lowering of wages. To say that the clock has been turned back a century is no exaggeration. A young auto worker today is making $14 to $15 an hour, which in real terms is the same amount that a Ford worker was making in 1914. On this basis, the auto companies have made $15 billion in profits last year. Mass unemployment is a deliberate policy maintained by the Obama administration because economic desperation has been used to drive down wages. This figure, I think, is also quite important. The blue line shows the share of the gross domestic product that goes to workers. And we can see from 1947, and then the very important turning point around 1979, 80, 81, the plummeting share of wages, which has accelerated under the Obama administration, which has certainly continued to decline. The other figure shows the share of the gross domestic product that goes to corporate profits. It is now at a record level, again went down after 2008, not only fully recovered, but has far surpassed it. Wages are at the highest level of any, under Obama, wages have reached the highest level of the GDP since the Second World War. Corporate profits have, and wages have reached the lowest level since 1947. What has Obama's policy been? Bank bailouts and quantitative easing, which I'll get to in a moment. 2009 auto restructuring. No restraints on executive compensation. No one held accountable for the crisis of 2008-09, and certainly no public works programs to hire the unemployed. And what is this quantitative easing? The Federal Reserve has purchased the toxic mortgage-backed assets of the banks, taking them off of their books. And we see from the Obama administration, it has now reached $1.6 trillion has been diverted from public resources to bailing out of the banks to enable them to invest money in the stock market. Vast sums of money and corporate profits are not used to build new factories or hire workers, let alone raise wages. But the corporations are using the money to buy back their own stocks in order to drive up the value of their stocks, and also to give dividends to their wealthy investors. There's a quote from Mark Faber from Gloom, Boom, Doom. Is not exactly a left publication, but he says, the professors at the Fed are pursuing a policy of deliberately shifting the wealth from the majority of U.S. households to the 1%. The Fed academics realize, even with their limited intellect and imagination, that once they retire, it is not the bottom 80% of the population that will pay them fat consulting and speaking fees, but the 1% at the very top of the wealth pyramid. In the stock market, after the crash of '08, has hit record levels. Virtually free money handed to the banks for investment, for the creation of, in fact, new speculative bubbles. Now, what are the conditions of the working class? This is a chart since the '08 crash. The labor force participation rate, those who should be working, who have fallen out of the labor market, which of course is concealed by the official unemployment figures. And then this is what has happened to workers' wages. The bottom, this is since 2000. The bottom 20% of the population has declined 4.5%, while wages for others have stagnated. And of course, the wealthiest segments of the population have skyrocketed. And this is also an extremely important chart, which begins in the 1940s, and it shows the growth in productivity of the working class. The top blue line shows that workers are producing more wealth than at any time in human history. Far fewer workers are producing far more output, but this line shows what has happened to wages. While productivity has increased, wages have stagnated or declined. And that is the basis of the enormous redistribution of wealth which has occurred. Under the Obama administration, 95% of all income gains have gone to the richest 1% of society. Not only the richest 1%, but the top 0.01%. This is the distribution of the richest layers of society. The ruling class, which controls the Democrats, Republicans, every lever of government, the courts, the media, the trade unions, is drunk with wealth. Everything must go in the relentless drive for their wealth accumulation. The ruling class looks at pensions and says, we want that. It looks at the art at the DIA and says, We want that. It looks at the money that's going to pay wages and benefits and insists we want that. This is the social and historical context of the Detroit bankruptcy and the political struggle which workers in the United States and internationally confront today. Thank you very much.